Where do your eyes go first? Okay, how about now? Our eyes don't go to the brightest or darkest parts of an image. It goes to the area of greatest contrast. In color grading, a common technique is to use masks to add vignettes to help draw our attention to an area of the frame. But I'm going to take it a step further, and I'm going to take away contrast from the surroundings so that the relative contrast on our subject is higher, thus drawing our attention there. In this close-up, it's clear that the greatest contrast is on our subject's face. But this is what the shot looked like originally. Now, the extreme brightness of the background is distracting, and it makes it feel like our subject has less contrast than they really do. And if we try to fight this by adding contrast to our subject, we end up fighting a losing battle and creating an image that doesn't really feel natural. And so instead, I'm going to take away contrast from the surroundings. I'm going to add a depth map, and I'm going to add it near the exposure and contrast nodes, since those are the adjustments I'm going to be making. So you can invert the depth map, adjust the map levels, and change the near limit so that it's no longer affecting our subject. Then I go to post-processing and I turn the filter down to 0, since I don't really like what this does, and I add a slight blur to help smoothen out the map. Now we can turn off our depth map preview and start to make changes. So for adjusting the contrast, I'll set the pivot point to 0.336, more on this later, and I'm going to take away contrast until it sits somewhere between 0.7 or 0.85, really depending on the amount of contrast on that specific shot. And if it's still distracting, you can use the HDR wheels to bring down the exposure a little. I especially love using this trick on interview setups or talking head setups to help draw attention to the subject speaking. When we right-click on a node and change its gamut to linear, the temperature and tint sliders and the gain wheel accurately change the white balance of our image the way that it would in camera. This allows us to accurately color correct our image in ways that tools like the offset wheel aren't able to do for us. Now, using your linear white balance tool, you can also start to make creative changes to the white balance as well. And one of my favorite things to do is to lean into a blue hour look. Using the temperature slider to cool down the image creates a nice deep navy blue hour look. And if you want it to feel a little more teal, you can start to bring in some green using the tint slider. To really sell the blue hour look, we can start to bring down the exposure using the HDR wheels, which give us an accurate way to change the exposure, similar to how it would change if we were changing the exposure in camera. Now, to make it as accurate as possible, you can go into the HDR panel and change it to your camera's color space. But since I've already converted my camera's color space to my timeline color space, I won't need to do that, and we'll talk about that more later. This tool is great for making creative changes, like creating a blue hour look, or it's great for making corrective changes as well. On a shot like this, where I didn't expose it great on the day, I'm able to accurately lift up the exposure in a way that the offset wheel wouldn't allow. As mentioned in the first tip, our eyes go to the area of greatest contrast. Now that also applies for color contrast. So sometimes we have an opportunity to create color contrast simply by changing the white balance. Not always, but if the opportunity is there, we should be able to see it and decide whether or not we want to do that. So in this shot here, I white balanced pretty great on the day. The fog is not too warm, not too cool. It's pretty evenly balanced. But this yellow jacket would pop a lot more on a cooler backdrop. So using our linear white balance node, I'm able to cool off the image a little and bring some blue into the background. And the opposite of this would be a shot like this, where on the day I white balance a little bit cooler, but because she's wearing a blue outfit, it's not really popping off a blue background as much as it would a warm or neutral background. So what I'm going to do is use my linear white balance node to warm up the image a little until the background is a more neutral black. And now we have an image where the subject is popping a lot more in the frame. So sometimes creating color contrast is about adding color to the background, and sometimes it's about taking it away. It really depends on what colors we see in the background and what colors our subject is wearing. When you look at cliché cinematic movies, what you'll notice is that the highlights sit high in the waveform like we'd expect, but the midtones sit much lower than something we'd find straight out of camera. So what I started doing is adding something that I like to call density-based contrast, where the contrast is actually about bringing the midtones down and lifting the highlights up. Whereas conventional ways of adding contrast typically push the highlights up and the shadows down, but end up leaving the midtones where they are. And while this adds contrast, it doesn't create a dense feeling to the midtones that we see in projects that are shot on film or are emulated to look like they're shot on film. So using the gamma wheel, we can bring our midtones down, but since it impacts the highlights a little, we'll need to use the gain wheel to lift those back up. A much nicer way to add saturation than using the saturation tool is to use a HSV node. So what we do is we change the color space to HSV, we turn off channel 1 and 3, and we're left with just the saturation channel. And by using the gamma wheel, we're able to add saturation in a way that's a lot like film, where the colors get denser as they become much more saturated. Now the problem is if an image already has a healthy level of saturation, or if we're going for something that has a desaturated look, we're not able to add this film-like saturation because we're already at a level that we don't want to exceed. So what I like to do is add a node after the HSV node where I can use the digital saturation tool to bring the saturation down, giving me more room to add the HSV saturation. By using the Davinci Y gamut color space to color grade, we're able to make much more aggressive, creative, and corrective changes to our image without risking breaking the image or creating artifacts in our video. So to color grade with Davinci Y gamut, go to your project settings, the color tab, set it to Davinci YRGB with the timeline color space of Davinci Y gamut and Davinci Intermediate. If you're on an Apple product, set your output color space to Rec. 709A. And if you're on an Apple product but coloring on an external monitor that's not Apple, or you're on a PC, use Rec. 709 Gamma 2.4 as the output color space. Now in the color tab, use an input color space transform node to transform your camera's color space to Davinci Y gamut. Then use an output node to transfer Davinci Y gamut to the final, which for me, because I'm on a MacBook Pro, would be Rec. 709A. Now that we're in the Davinci Y gamut color space, middle gray will be at 0.336, which I mentioned earlier when I was changing the contrast pivot point on the depth map. So what does it mean by setting the pivot point to middle gray? Well, what that means is when I change the contrast now, I'm not impacting the exposure of the image. You can see that if I change the pivot point, I'm actually changing the exposure of the image with the contrast. And the reason this is kind of annoying is because if we set an exposure that we feel is nice in the first node, then we move on and start to add contrast, but it's not set to middle gray, we can start to impact the exposure we had already put in place, and now we're going back and forth between the two nodes trying to find something we're happy with. But by setting it to middle gray, we're able to bring a ton of contrast into the image without really impacting the exposure we had set in the first node. And this is especially helpful on shots that don't have a lot of contrast, like an overcast day or a foggy day. Adding contrast adds saturation, and that can distract us from setting a proper amount of contrast on our image. So what I like to do is add a black and white node at the very end of my node tree that I can quickly turn on and off when I'm adjusting exposure and contrast. So if I turn the black and white node off and I'm not happy with the color, I know it's not because of the exposure and contrast. What it often is the white balance just wasn't set in a nice place in camera, and so it either feels hyper warm or hyper cool, and all I need to do is use my linear white balance node to bring things back towards the middle of the vector scope. The beautiful thing about a LUT is that it can add this consistent, unique look across your entire project. Now, I created a LUT specifically for that, something I could add to every shot across an entire project, but I'm not here to tell you you need that. You can get a lot out of the free LUTs that are in DaVinci Resolve. Specifically, the film looks are the ones that I rely on the most. Now, these were built to work with Cineon Film Log as its input, but I find when you do that, it's too heavy-handed of a look and it requires too much tweaking, which kind of slows you down. So what I like to do instead is add these at the very end of my color grade once it's already been converted to Rec. 709, and I'll change the key output down to 0.2 or less so that it's very subtle, but it's still able to add a unique touch across the entire project. I'll use D55 for shots that I want to feel warmer, D60 for shots more neutral, and D65 for shots that I want to feel cooler. My goal is to provide you with the tools needed to become a filmmaker. Whether that's cinematography, editing, storytelling, or color grading, I'm sharing everything that I learn along the way and everything I've already learned that's gotten me to where I am today. So if that interests you, I'd love for you to stick around, and I appreciate you watching the video. So thanks a bunch, and I'll see you in the next one.